As Cian Corla. The really significant innovation in this bill is obviously Part 7, both giving the Residential Tenancies Board the option to pursue criminal sanctions against landlords who breach rent pressure zones, but also at the same time giving them civil sanctions, the power to investigate and where they feel appropriate to impose sanctions for landlords in breach both of the annual rent registration and the rent pressure zones. And I suppose this is really the really important bit of the bill. The rest of the bill is important, but this is the really crucial bit, and I think it's important we take some time, both here and in committee, to get it right. And what I'd say, first of all, is in reality the criminal sanctions will be very rarely used. First of all, because the RTB won't have the power to produce the investigations, and therefore the burden of proof they'll have to bring before the courts will be very, very significant, not to mention the costs. So in some senses, the criminal sanctions will be, say, for repeat offenders, for landlords whose breaches have either been continuous or of such severity that they fall into the criminal sanction. But in reality, we know from this and other agencies, they will be rarely used. So the really important sanction is the civil sanction. That's the one we have to make sure works right. Because what we need to come out of this piece of legislation is a number of relatively speedy, relatively high-profile cases where landlords who are breaking the law are found to be so, and the sanctions are applied as quickly as possible. And it's this I welcome in principle, but I have two very significant concerns which I'm genuinely appealing to the Minister and his officials to look at between now and committee stage and think about. The first is the timelines. If you add up all of the timelines that are proposed, including the discretionary additional timelines that the authorised officer can consider, you could be looking at very lengthy investigations, and that's before we get to the issue of circuit court confirmation. And the problem with that, of course, is during all of that period, the tenant, who is more than likely paying a rent above the rent pressure zone 4%, still has to pay that rent, unless, of course, that tenant separately takes a complaint to the Residential Tenancies Board for mediation or adjudication. Now, that could be 6, 8, in some cases 12 months long, and I think that is far too long a period. So I'm urging the Minister and his officials just to look at that and to try and bring it more in line with the kind of average timelines we have for other kinds of RTB cases currently in place. But for me, the big problem is the requirement for circuit court confirmation. And that's contained in section 148Z subsection 2. So what this means is the authorised officer will conduct an investigation, will make a finding of fact. The Residential Tenancies Board will then decide that there's a breach and want to issue a sanction. But unlike the power that they can currently operate for landlords significantly in breach, for example, of the provisions to deal with issues of antisocial behaviour of their tenants, the Residential Tenancies Board will have to go to the Circuit Court for court approval. That will cost a significant amount of money for every case. It could cost as much as €5,000 at current cost for barristers at the Circuit Court. It could take weeks, and in some places, because of the court sitting schedules, it could take months, which means it's not only expensive, but it will delay the process. But it is also not legally necessary. Today, in fact yesterday, the Residential Tenancies Board issued a fine of €20,000 for a landlord for non-compliance with the provisions of the Residential Tenancies Act. That landlord obviously has a right to appeal that to the High Court, so there is due process. But no Circuit Court confirmation was required for that. So I don't understand why there would be any requirement for such provision, particularly when that provision will actively undermine exactly what the Minister is trying to do, which is to ensure the speedy address of landlords who are breaching it. Now, my understanding is that we have an Attorney-General who takes a particularly orthodox view of the divisions between administrative justice and more traditional practices of judiciary sanction. I have to say, that's the wrong approach for us to go, and I suspect the Minister might have some sympathy with what I'm saying. I'm interested to hear his own views and the views of the officials, but this is going to be a major issue at committee, and I would just urge people to look at this. Yes, have the appeal to the High Court or to the courts for a landlord when they're sanctioned. That's absolutely required legally and constitutionally. But the idea that we would have every single case being referred to the Circuit Court for confirmation simply makes no sense. I also want to warmly welcome the Minister's confirmation yesterday, although he had given to us previously, of bringing forward amendments in relation to student-specific accommodation on campus and private. That's very, very needed. I would echo Deputy O'Brien's request that it might be useful, if the time allows, for us to have sight of that before formal committee stage. But having spoken to the officials when they presented at the last committee hearing on this issue, I think we're absolutely on the same page, and I'd welcome that. My one concern is we're beginning to see some universities increasing rents now for the 19-20 academic year, way earlier than they would ordinarily do. One was in the news recently, and I think it might be helpful for the Minister even to try and use some soft power publicly to say that this really isn't appropriate, particularly for publicly funded bodies, to try and circumvent the changes that he's seeking to introduce in this legislation. I do also welcome the confirmation of the work around the rent register. The one thing I would say, however, is if that is a little bit more legally complex, I would prefer if that is in the next piece of legislation than to delay this, because, as the Minister rightly said, we want to progress this as soon as is possible. And the Minister also mentioned yesterday that he would be bringing forward amendments which would clarify the issue of what happens to the rent pressure zones when they're due to expire under the current legislative sunset clause. I think the sooner the Minister can publicly say what the intentions are, the better, because there is some concern out there among tenants who are just fearful that the thing is going to stop. And I presume what the Minister is looking at is some mechanism to extend. And even if the Minister was to say, it's my intention to extend, and the detail of that we'll deal with at committee or report stage, I think that would be helpful, particularly for tenants that are concerned. So look, just to conclude, I think we're 95% of the way there with this bill. I think the Minister and his officials have done a very, very good job dealing with some complex issues. I just would really urge some serious second thinking from the Minister and the staff of the department around the Circuit Court confirmation and the timelines. And I suppose the only other thing I'd say is that whether it's by way of government amendment to this bill or further amendment at the next residential tenancies legislation, I would ask the Minister to still consider applying the power of investigation and sanction to all tenancies. I mean, if a landlord is breaking the law outside of a rent pressure zone, they're breaking the law. And clearly, the powers of investigation and sanction should apply there just as they do inside the rent pressure zones. And equally, particularly with notices to quit and invalid notices to quit, which are clearly and deliberately invalid, I think there's a real value in applying the investigation and sanctions powers to those. And again, just to emphasise the point I made yesterday, I think there's a value in looking at, not in this legislation, but in the next bill, serious breach of minimum standards, serious breach of overcrowding, just like we have serious antisocial behaviour in the current RTA, and possibly applying this investigations and sanction regime to those, albeit with the inspections done as they currently are by the local authorities and environmental health community welfare officers. So Sinn Féin will be supporting the bill. I know the Minister was probably contacted at his office today. The Housing Committee has time available next week, has time available the week after for committee stage, so we're ready to proceed. But we would like you to consider some of the concerns that I and other members have raised, and I'm sure will raise throughout the remainder of the debate tonight.